Hi Year 12s, it's Miss Brooks here. This will be a short screencast. Well, who knows how short it'll be, we'll see. On the TSSM 2018 Section A topic for stories we tell, and this is topic 1. I will endeavour to do one for topic 2 and possibly a couple of other topics from the previous exam papers that we have covered. I will also link this document underneath the video, so if you are interested, you are more than welcome to go and have a look at that. Some of it's by me and some of it's by my class, so some essays are unpacked in quite a bit of detail and some have brief and some not at all, but they're all listed there from the practice papers we've done this exam revision period. So let's start with topic 1. Sarah Polley gives an essentially human insight into how people and circumstances make us what we are. Now, I've just got a quick reminder about how to structure your introduction here. That need not be a big deal, but basically these are just some key vocab. You need to set up what the text is, what the form is, the author of the text, and a link to the theme, which in this case is insight into how people and circumstances make us what we are. And that's probably looking at the way in which Sarah, Diane, Michael, etc., their lives are shaped by the experiences that they have. Now, this question has absolutely so many different paths you could go down. So if you have a different idea when you first read this, or you wrote about a different idea in your practice exam, do not be dismayed at all. I would expect that not everybody would necessarily do what I've done, so don't worry about that. As long as you can substantiate that, you can look at all of the different ways that people in the text are shaped by the experiences that they've had, including the director herself. So what I've done is I've written a bit of a topic sentence for each. For some of them I've got evidence, some and explain, not always. It's just kind of a quick unpacking. The reason I've written the topic sentence rather than just talking off the cuff is because if I was writing it myself, I'd be thinking as I'm writing and I'd change things. So by writing out my 3 topic sentences, when I talk to you about it, I can make sure I'm clear about exactly where I want to go with it. So don't be dismayed by that. That's just me ensuring that I don't go on a wildly different path than where I start at and confuse you. So let's start with driving idea number 1. Polly's documemoir is a grand tribute to the life of her mother, a woman she hopes to humanise for a more sympathetic audience. As director, Polly attempts to form a more concrete image of her mother, a woman who was deeply loved and whose loss is still deeply felt. And I've obviously got deeply there twice, you could change that up. But basically my point is that I want to talk about how she humanises her mother, how the opening of the film, the first kind of 20 minutes, I suppose, really sets up a concrete kind of image about Diane and gives a really kind of human insight into who she was according to people, like their first understandings of her. And so you can talk about the interrogation process or the interview process if you like, and that Sarah is assembling this story from the memories of others, and she does that by weaving together multiple narratives, some of which are in the form of interviews, and obviously we have the narrative layer of Michael narrating his email, the voiceover. You've got the interviews, you've got the Super 8 footage, and you also have the music and other intertextual references like the newspaper clippings, the archival footage of Diane, etc. So there are all these different layers working together, but I think in my kind of contention here is that in the first 20 minutes it's really about setting up the kind of person that Diane is, and that is that she was loved and that her loss is still deeply felt. So Sarah says to them, tell me the whole story from the beginning. And this is quite a daunting task, but I think she is trying to really establish who Diane is and find if there is some kind of chorus about who she was. And she does that, and she splices together this interview footage and the Super 8 footage to find that her mother is fun. She was a good time Charlie, the most fun in the world. She was warm, etc. And this is substantiated with footage of Diane being affectionate with the children. She's dancing, she's laughing, she's busy. So she's moving around the house, she's going to work, and she's got this like tribe of children following her. And she's constantly in activity. And you could look at the way in which the girls categorize her as she was always busy, she did all the cooking, all the cleaning, etc., versus Michael kind of proudly saying, give me a list of fatherly duties. And there's a suggestion that it was, she took on more than her fair share of the role in the home. And Sarah is paying tribute to all the things that she did for her family. The film for Sarah, therefore, is a journey not of loss, like her loss is deeply felt, but really it's about discovery and healing. And it's the discovery of who her mother was, because her mother passed away when she was only 11 years old. And the reason I've put this bit on is because there's a reference to this poem by a lady called Adrienne Rich, and the poem is called Diving into the Wreck. And it reflects or captures this idea that what Sarah is doing is essentially alone, attempting to put together an image, going on a journey to find out who her mother was. And yes, she uses the voice of others, but it is her alone that's trying to figure it out. And these people are obviously shaping that journey that she is on. So as part of that journey, she's creating a more concrete image of her mother, which is what I want to set up at the start. And I think that's fine. You can do that. And then I would move on to say, the interrogation process employed by Polley reveals a woman who felt constrained by the expectations of her time. She was a woman who yearned for more demonstrative affection from the men in her life. The culmination of the rigid social norms and the absence of the intimacy she desired frames Polley's empathetic examination of the circumstances that ultimately led to her mother's seemingly reckless behaviour. And what I'm trying to do in this paragraph is basically set up that Sarah is trying to justify, I think, retrospectively, her mother's actions. And by doing so, not in a way that we judge her, but in a way that we understand maybe why she did what she did, which led to her original affair with Michael, but later her affair with Harry, which Mark described as reckless. So I would set that up by talking about her first marriage to George Buchanan, who was the man she was supposed to marry. Harry describes this as acrimonious and exceedingly difficult. And Johnny says she was always trying to get out from under anything she felt controlled her, and George was a man who she felt controlled by. This revelation of her first marriage really disrupts what appeared to be earlier a linear narrative, and that was Diane's story, and it was from her meeting Michael, her marriage to Michael, Sarah, the birth of a couple of kids, the birth of Sarah, her work in Montreal. Sorry, obviously that's around the other way. She worked in Montreal and then had Sarah, then her death, and then we have this revelation that Harry is the father, and then it goes back even further. We jump back and see that there was a first marriage before even Michael was on the scene, and this highlights that she's much more complex than what we might have originally thought, and that she's setting up the circumstances and the people that were around Diane that made her who she was, okay? And so Susie says, I think she saved herself. I think she grabbed onto a life buoy. And she's admirable of that, and I think all the girls are admirable of that, and I think even Susie and Johnny as well, Sarah and Johnny as well, are admirable of the fact that she decided she no longer wanted to put up with that. However, the consequences of that was punishment, both in her personal life and in her public life. So in the media, we saw the newspapers writing things like, society cannot live without morals. Its morals are those standards of conduct which the reasonable man approves. And there was another one that says, she has allowed her desire for a career to overtop her domestic duties. She is unrepentant. So we see the consequences of her action are judgment by society, and the price she paid was costly. She can only see her children like once a month. She finds out that the stepmother is abusing the children, and this kind of is deeply upsetting, and Mark says that she couldn't protect them, is something that he observes. And basically all this works together to set up later why Diane will refuse to leave Michael for Harry, because she doesn't want a repeat of that, but also the way in which possibly Diane was further oppressed. So maybe why she, for a long time, maybe put up with her relationship with Michael, even though she felt like it wasn't as fulfilling, because she didn't want a repeat of what had happened before. She was scarred by that experience. Now, you may not need this bit here because you probably have talked about enough, but this is just a couple of points about why she had an affair with Harry, because of how she felt in her first marriage. But again, it's the way she felt treated, and that therefore led to her infidelity. The final paragraph, I would look at the consequences of this revelation. So we've said into how people and circumstances make us what we are. So we've said why she had an affair and like how she got to that situation, and now the consequences of that on not only Diane but on Sarah, her father, Michael, also Harry and the other children, and even her friends. And that's what I mean. You could look at each of those people and kind of look at it in a different way. So by no means is this a limitation. You pick who you want and justify it, and that's fine. And the examiner probably will appreciate someone who's a little bit left of field and not necessarily picking the obvious, okay? So the consequences of this revelation of Sarah's paternity and her mother's repeated infidelity has ramifications for not only Sarah, but her family and her mother's friends. It is the unveiling of secrets which moves her storytellers into the act of reflection to consider the ways in which their lives have been shaped by this truth. It is through both the interviews and the meta-narrative discussion that the extent of this impact is revealed. So, the initial image of Diane was challenged by a growing sense that she was dissatisfied, that she wanted to get out of her life, and she was a person bored with things as they currently stood. And so, there's empathy from her children, and even Michael suggests, when he finds out what happened, he says, if you have sympathy, have it for Harry, because he loved and lost. And I think this, that truth could have made him very bitter, but the impact of that is that he's actually quite grateful for the experience that he did have with Sarah and with Diane and their whole family, and so suggests that he was privileged to have got her back and have had that experience, and to have been able to raise Sarah in the aftermath of Diane's death, and that made him very close to Sarah, and he wouldn't have given that up for anything. And so his sympathy is for Harry, who loved and lost. And you can look at then even the exchange between Michael and Sarah and say, well, the impact of this secret and all the consequences, if we're looking back at our topic, I keep coming back to it, but make us what we are. And, well, Sarah is someone who feels a sense of loss, and Michael challenges her and says, is this about a search for a father? And that's in their email exchange. And you can have a look at the way that she uses both genuine and faux footage to try to bring to life her mother and the memories of others, because ultimately this situation has led her to search for the truth, to find out who she actually was, because she feels like what she did know has been thrown into chaos, and she is, like in the Adrian Reach poem, circling above the wreckage, trying to figure out, what is true, what is not, and, how to tell this story in a way that makes sense and does justice to her mother. But in the end, despite the kind of sympathy that is felt for Harry, and maybe the uncertainty that Sarah feels even in making this film, and her own kind of the ambiguity that existed around her parentage, and now the fact that her biological father is not the man who raised her, they remain united as a family. And you can see that in that recreation of footage at the family home I don't know if it's by the lake or something like that, and the birth of the new granddaughter Michael talks about as kind of a renewing force. The children, they all come back together again. And so you can come back to your question and go, circumstances make us what we are, that despite the revelation of these secrets and the revelation of infidelity, the Polley family as a whole have been renewed. They have become closer as a consequence of Diane's actions and the realization of Diane's actions later. And I think if you just want to touch back on that idea of human insight, I think you could talk about the way that Sarah shows empathy or is kind of compassionate towards her mother, and so are her siblings, and so are Diane's friends. I think they talk about the way she felt, and that justifies her actions. Okay, so that's all I've got for that one. Hopefully you can make sense of all my ideas there. Now there's lots there, you can limit it down as you need, and go from there. Good luck. If you've got any questions, of course, send me an email. Thank you.